So this is a pretty interesting situation. What you're looking at is the Triangle Genese Trio, a 12-year-old bookshelf speaker that originally sold for $2,795 a pair. So why am I talking about it today in 2020? Well, it's because of a number of unique circumstances that have allowed this speaker to represent a pretty good value in bookshelf speakers, even by today's standards. So here's what's going on. Even though this speaker has been around for a while and technically replaced by a similar looking and much more expensive line called the Signature Series, Triangle has nonetheless supported the Genese line this entire time. In fact, they've been quietly selling these speakers to their European dealers as an affordable alternative to the Signature line. So think of it like this Triangle secret menu item, only now that secret menu item has finally become available to those of us in North America to the tune of $1,400 a pair. So what do you get for that kind of money? Well, as you can tell, you get a full-size two-way front-ported speaker that is very, and I mean very, curvilicious. So now let's talk about some of the design elements, starting with this top semi-pod here. Now the whole point behind it is to help isolate the high-frequency driver from the cabinet, because most cabinets have woofers. Woofers are busy moving air in and out of the cabinet that generates a lot of energy, a lot of resonance, and this pod is designed to help mitigate the influence of all of that energy. Now, this is nothing new. Speaker manufacturers have been doing this for many decades, even before B&W popularized the design. However, I noticed Triangle is also trying to mitigate diffraction with this design, particularly the flare around the horn. I also noticed that they use this rubber material, which is actually a very smart choice. And now inside of this horn, we have a 1-inch titanium dome driver with this long phase plug around it, which is designed to help disperse sound evenly out into the room. Because what Triangle is trying to go for here is they're trying to give you a presentation to where you don't even realize you're listening to a horn-loaded speaker. So they want to give you the benefits of it: slightly better power handling characteristics, better sensitivity, better integration with the woofer due to a lower crossover point, but with very few of the drawbacks, because horns can be very localized. You could recognize where the sound's coming from, and the off-axis performance of horns tends to be not so great. But I gotta say, after doing some listening, I feel like Triangle did a very good job with the implementation of this design. And what's cool about semi-pods, as opposed to tweeters that are completely above the cabinet, is that it puts them in closer proximity to the mid-range driver, in this case the woofer cone, which helps to allow for better integration between both drivers. On the bottom here, we are going to have a 6-inch woofer. This uses a hybrid cone material. It's going to be paper and polymer. Beneath that, we are going to have our port. And it's important to note that these drivers are both designed and manufactured by Triangle in-house. And that is going to be it for the front of the speakers, guys. So now let's take a quick look at the back, and then I'm going to talk about how they sound. Alright, so here's the back of the Trio, and honestly, there's not a whole lot to say here. You have a set of 5-way binding posts made out of a brass material, and even though I never bi-amped or bi-wired these speakers during the evaluation, it's nice to know you have that option. So there's just one more thing I need to show off, and this is actually going to be a first in Zero Fidelity history, which is packaging. So, those of you outside of North America may not be able to understand our pain here, but our couriers are outright abusive with packages. I mean, they will literally throw them at your doorstep. So it's nice to see something that is so well packaged, especially for a hi-fi component under $2,000. It just gives you the assurance that maybe, just maybe, they'll arrive in one piece. So, having said that, that's going to be my overview of the Trio. So now it's time to talk about how they sound. So when it comes to raw performance, you can actually summarize the overall sonic character of the Trio using just 3 words. And those 3 words are lively yet warm. And what's so interesting about that is that it makes the Trio a very different sounding speaker from just about everything else in Triangle's current product portfolio. In fact, this isn't really a coincidence. When you read about the marketing literature behind all their different product lines, they all say the same thing, that they believe that a musically engaging experience is something that projects in a forward way, something that's all about speed and resolution, openness, and dynamic output. Yet when you listen to the Trio, it becomes very obvious that they were aiming for something a little bit different with the Genese line. Now, subjectively speaking, I actually kind of prefer that, and here's why. The problem is that when you get a highly resolving, forward-sounding speaker that's all about openness and clarity, it can sound amazing on the right recorded material. But as soon as you throw something like, say, 90s grunge rock towards them, that is when the illusion is just completely shattered. Not only are you aware of the fact that you're listening to resolving speakers, but you're also painfully aware of the fact that they are now just absolutely destroying the music that you're listening to, or shall I say, revealing it for how trashy it really is in terms of recording quality. Meaning that sometimes you may have more fun listening to your music on your car stereo system than through your high-end super resolute speakers. What I like so much about the Trio is that, yes, it's lively, but it doesn't project in that forward way like a lot of other triangles do. Instead, it's actually more of a laid-back sound. It takes on this more warm and dark presentation. And the trade-off to that is it allows you to listen to a wider variety of music, and you still get to enjoy just a little bit of liveliness on top, but it's not so overdone that it takes you out of the moment as you switch between different types of music. And I think that's really important. So let's start off with the treble and how that manifests. So with treble, when you listen to brass instruments in real life, you're going to notice that, no, they're not smooth. In fact, they can be very aggressive sounding, and you're going to get that out of this speaker. In fact, the closer you are to a brass instrument, or in this case, the closer you have the microphone to it, the more aggressive it can actually be. The speaker does a good job of capturing that, but it doesn't go over the top with it to where once you switch to something else, suddenly the presentation's all about the treble. In fact, I think Triangle did a great job of giving you this lively sound without even making you realize that you're listening to a horn. The only time that you're really going to be drawn to the tweeter in particular is during, I would say, just very poor recordings or something that just has this huge bump somewhere in the treble. That's when you may become aware of it, but otherwise you get this lively sound that isn't over the top. And now let's talk about the mid-range. Instead of having a mid-range that's all about this incredibly snappy response and giving you the most open sound it can, instead this is going to be a little warmer sounding, and it trades off that speed for density. So now the music just has a bigger sense of scale to it. It sounds fuller. And a good example would be when you're listening to a well-recorded orchestral piece. With something that's more about linearity and speed and resolution, you're going to notice that it does a better job of identifying all the different sounds occurring within that recording. It sounds like you can hear all the different members that are playing their instruments. You don't quite get the same effect through these, but the trade-off is that the sense of scale through these is going to be much more authentic, which you're going to notice, especially once the music starts getting a little bit more dynamic. It's a trade-off. And then you have the bass. The bass isn't going to be the quickest bass in the world, but it's going to be full, especially for a speaker of this size. Some people may not even feel like they need a subwoofer, especially in a smaller room. And I'm the kind of person that if I had the choice between a speaker that has the quickest bass that sounds maybe just a little bit like it's lacking cojones, or something that actually sounds very full but maybe not the quickest bass in the world, I tend to err towards something that has that fuller bass because to me it's just more fun. And I'm the kind of person that listens to an incredibly wide variety of music, and I find it valuable when I find a speaker that I can confidently just go to them, listen to what I want to listen to, and focus more on the music than on the speaker replicating the sound. And I think that's exactly what Triangle was trying to do with the Genèse, and I think they did a good job. And even though the speaker is old, I think its virtues still hold up today. The only trick behind it is knowing how to get the best sound out of them, and that leads me to tips and advice on how to really get the most from these speakers. So the good news is that the Trios are fairly easy speakers to accommodate. There's only two things that you really need to be aware of when it comes to positioning them in your room. Number one is that they're going to be sensitive to the height of the drivers as it relates to your ears. So in other words, when you're sitting down and you're listening to these speakers, in order to get the best performance out of them, you want to make sure that your ears are in a position to where they're between either the tweeter and the woofer or directly in line with the center of the woofer cone. And what this is going to do is this is going to give you the best integration between the treble, the mid-range, and the bass. If you get it wrong and your ears are directly in line with the tweeter, then the treble is going to be fairly bright and it's going to draw a lot of attention to itself. If you're in an opposite position to where the drivers are above where your ears are located, that's when it's going to become very bass heavy, and if anything, maybe even a little bit dull sounding. So something to be aware of. Next, these are speakers that enjoy having room to breathe. Even though they're front ported, they output a lot of bass energy. So if you give them 1.5 to 2 feet away from any wall boundary, that's when you're going to get the best performance. Otherwise, like I said, these speakers are super easy to accommodate. They lay down a huge soundstage, so if you want the biggest soundstage from them, have them pointed out directly into the room with no toe-in, and you're going to get a very enveloping sound. But for most people, I think you're going to prefer just a little bit of toe-in with the drivers slightly pointed towards you. And what this is going to do is give you better focus in between the speakers and still maintain the majority of that big soundstage. Moving on, let's talk about equipment matching. So these speakers are very easy to accommodate in this regard. They're very easy to drive, so if you have low-powered tube amplifiers, maybe you're in a smaller room where you don't listen at loud volumes, you can get away with as low as 10 watts per channel with these speakers and still drive them to fairly good volumes. They sound great at low listening levels, so you don't need a whole lot of power in that regard. But I think for most people who are going to be buying this, you're going to want to be between 50 to 100 watts per channel. Obviously, if you're in a bigger room and you listen at louder volumes, maybe you're going to want more than 100 watts per channel. In terms of voicing and the kind of equipment that they work best with, they're super versatile. In my experience so far, they've paired up well to Class D amplifiers. Maybe not the best match, but still a good match. A better match would be your traditional Class AB amplifier. Class A would also work very well. But you don't really have to be too concerned about the type of components. For example, I paired them up to the Cambridge CX-A81, which has similar voicing to the Trio. You think it would have been too much of a good thing, but actually makes for a very musical combination. I would say if your budget is under $1,000 for equipment, the Iotavx SA3 is going to be a great match. But if you have more money to spend, which I definitely recommend because the performance ceiling of these speakers is very high, at $1,000, the Dane's Minuetto, something that's fairly neutral, is going to be a good match. In fact, I personally prefer gear on these speakers that's somewhat more neutral in character. Something like that, or if you have more money, the Parasound Halo Hint 6, a fairly even-going integrated amplifier with just a little bit of warmth. That makes for a really good match. But don't stress out too much about that aspect of things. Just make sure you have enough power to take care of your needs. You'll be good to go. Anyways, that's going to be it for this section. So now let's go over some of the caveats. Okay, so now it's time to go over some of the less flattering things about the Trio. So number one, as I mentioned before, even though this is an easy speaker to work with, it is sensitive about speaker height, meaning that some of you may need to go out and buy new stands to accommodate these speakers. I think on average, most people are going to want anywhere between 24 to 26 inch stands. Number two, as with any speaker that uses a gloss finish, especially if you buy the gloss piano black, well, it's like a magnet for dust and fingerprints. You do have the option of buying white, even though I know not a lot of people like white finishes. And then moving on, as with every hi-fi product, it has a very distinct sound. Not everybody's going to like it. Number four, as far as I know, there's only going to be one retailer in North America that carries these speakers, and they don't have a showroom, which means you can't really audition it before you buy it, unless a Canadian distributor actually brings it on board and sells it through one of their retailers there. And then lastly, and most importantly, these speakers do not sound very good out of the box. Break-in with these is a pretty real thing. And now this is something I normally don't mention here at this channel because while I definitely believe in break-in on a lot of different products, the truth is usually when I pull something out of the box that's brand new, while I will frequently hear a difference between 0 hours of time versus say 100 hours of time, it's normally not significant enough for me to mention in a review. This is the exception to the rule. This speaker out of the box is going to sound a little bit disjointed. Like here's the tweeter, here's the woofer with very poor integration. It'll sound overly warm, borderline boomy sounding, and that's because the woofer just can't keep up with the tweeter. But give it some time. Give it, I would say, 50 real hours of playtime, and you'll notice that the integration is going to become much better and that the woofer is going to become a little bit more tame, a little quicker, and just a little better integrated with the overall presentation. But if you're looking for instant gratification out of the box, and you know that's your personality type, then it's best to avoid these speakers altogether. Other than that though, I would say that they offer a very good value for the money, and that leads me to my final thoughts. So, the Triangle Genese Trio. It's good to finally have this secret menu item available in North America. And personally speaking, I think they represent a fantastic value for the money. In fact, I don't mind saying that I feel like they can compete very well against just about every bookshelf speaker I've heard, all the way up to $2,000 a pair. Now, beyond that price point, that's when competition gets a lot more heated. But from $2,000 on down, I mean, if you're in the market for a set of large two-way monitors, you need to consider these. And personally, what I like so much about them is that they have this high-end aesthetic to them, but they have an otherwise unpretentious sound. Now, clearly it's not going to be for everybody. There's going to be people out there who want something that's more forward sounding, a little bit more open, faster, more dynamic, and all of that's very fair. But for somebody who likes that mix between warmth and liveliness, this is definitely something that you can be very happy with for a long time. Anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on the Triangle Trio. As always, the bonus section is going to contain a lot of different comparisons for those of you who like that. But if you've reached the end of the line, then I appreciate you stopping by. And until next time, peace. So look, guys, I got a lot of ground to cover here, so I'm going to rifle through these comparisons. So the first question that I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask is, hey, I have the Bro 3s. I'm looking to upgrade. Is it worth stepping up to something like the Triangle Trio? And the answer is, hell yeah, this is definitely something you should do because this is a much better speaker. Don't get me wrong, I like the Bro 3. I think it has the kind of sound that a lot of people want for something at its respective price point. But as soon as you step up to something like the Trio, you just get better sound in pretty much every regard. Now, the main differences here is that the Trio is the warmer sounding speaker and it doesn't have the forward sounding upper mid-range that the Bro 3 has. But if you can live without that and you want something that's more resolute, refined, fuller range, just better in pretty much every way, yep, go with the Trio and don't look back. Okay, so now it's time to talk about how the Trio compares to something that's more expensive than it is. In this case, the KEF R3. And really, this is a story of opposite sounding speakers because the KEF, unlike the Trio, is all about that speed, that openness, that clarity, projecting in a forward way thanks to that bump in the upper mid-range and lower treble. Even though both speakers are lively, this is definitely more aggressive, but it also has that cleaner sound, whereas the Trio focuses more on body and having warmth and that sense of scale, so it sounds bigger, it has more bass output. It's just something that is going to be a little bit more forgiving of poorly recorded material, but ultimately it's up to you to decide what you prefer. Both speakers sound really good at low volumes, but as you increase the volume, the Trio seems to handle it better than the KEFs do, which can get overly aggressive at louder volumes. Both speakers actually respond well to tube amplifiers, but the Trios are easier to drive, so you'll get more volume out of them if you're a fan of tubes. So now, let's move on. Okay, so for the next two products I want to talk about, I don't have them here for a physical comparison, but I can nonetheless tell you about how they stack up. So let's talk about how the Trio competes against something like a similar priced Comet EZ. So believe it or not, they're very different sounding speakers. The Comet is going to be brighter sounding, thinner within the upper mid-range. It's going to have a more open sounding mid-range with quicker bass. The trade-off is that the Trio is going to be lively sounding, but not quite as aggressive. It's going to be fuller in the upper mid-range. It's going to overall have a bigger sense of scale to it, a lot more bass output, and overall it's just going to be more forgiving in nature. So now let's move on to the Buchardt S400. This is going to be a mother humper of a comparison because it is a very fierce one. I think both speakers are very, very good for the money. It just depends on what you want. Both of them have this warm, kind of laid back presentation to them, a little bit dark sounding, but the difference is that the Triangle is going to be more lively compared to the smoother sounding Buchardt. What you prefer is going to boil down to personal taste. I do think the mid-range on the Buchardt S400 is a little bit more pure and honest than what you get out of the Trio, but the Trio has that bigger sense of scale. It is the bigger speaker, and it also has more bass output and will sound cleaner at higher volumes than the Buchardt. And also, this speaker will sound a little bit better at lower volumes than the Buchardt, which needs just a little bit of power applied to it in order to really come into its own. The Triangle doesn't quite need that. If I had to choose between which one I would keep over the long haul, oh my god, I don't really know yet, but it would be close. I mean, that's how close of a comparison this is. So now let's move on to the last and perhaps the most important comparison on this list, how they compare to the much more expensive Signature Thetas. Okay, it's the end of the review. This is how things go with me. Let's do it. So, one of these speakers is the Genese Trio, which you can pick up for $1,400 a pair. The other is the Signature Theta, which you can pick up for the low, low price of $4,500 a pair. Do you know which is which? Well, I admit that even in person, it can be difficult to tell the difference between the two. So let me just go ahead and give this away. The speaker on my right is the Signature Theta, or nearest to me, I should say. And when you take a close look, you can start to identify some of the differences. For example, the accent pieces on the Signature Theta are lighter in color. This allows the speaker to pop a little bit more. And the quality of the paint on the Signature Theta is slightly, and I do mean slightly, better than what you get on the Trio. And the dead giveaway is the top of the pod is gloss black, whereas the Trio is just a regular rubber. But when you lift the speakers, it's a very obvious difference. The Signature Thetas are heavier, and that's partially because they're built to a higher quality degree. For example, the Trio is made in China, whereas the Signature Theta is made in France, hence the huge jump in price. But it's even more than that. When you look at the drivers, there are actually differences between them. This is the same type of driver, except it's now been improved. It's better. Same thing with the tweeter, same thing with the crossover components, and the net result of that is a pretty big difference in terms of sound. So when you listen to the Trio, you get this lively yet warm character. But when you switch to something like the Signature Theta, you're getting a similar presentation, only now it is a lot more refined and a lot cleaner and just flat out more high-end. The treble, for example, is way more refined. It's more resolute. It's actually more prominent than on the Trio, so that means it draws more attention to itself, but when you're listening to a really good recording, it's definitely on a different level. The mid-range, while it still has a slightly warm character, it's not quite as warm as what you get on the Trio. Instead, it's cleaner, it's more resolving sounding, and the same thing applies to the bass. The bass is definitely tighter, more resolving, and it's just able to keep up with more difficult passages better than the Trio. The compromise, though, is that the Trio still sounds a little bit fuller by direct comparison. So, as always, it's a matter of what you want, but I will say this. The Signature Theta is more that classic high-end speaker that's a little bit picky about how you have it positioned in the room. For example, the Trio is pretty easygoing. No, it's not as resolving, but it's more forgiving of poorly recorded material, and you don't need a whole lot of patience in order to get great sound out of it. Whereas the Signature Theta, if you want the best balance between it, then you want to be careful with the kind of equipment you use. For example, the Signature Theta responds better to warmer sounding gear or tube amps. That's usually a really good way to go with the Signature Theta, whereas the Trio, you don't have to be as careful, but the trade-off is it's just not going to be as resolving. It's partially why you can get away with that. So it's just a matter of what you want. Now, is it worth the difference? Well, that's up to you to decide. I think the big factor here behind the cost is that the Trio is made in China, whereas the Signature Theta is made in France. That's going to be a huge part of your cost there. Otherwise, though, they're both really good speakers, but I think the value for the money goes with the Trio, just hands down. Especially if you're like me and you listen to a wide variety of music. But anyways, guys, I'm done talking about the Trio. Hopefully you guys have found this video to be useful. Until next time, take it easy and peace.